Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us for the presentation of Backyard Chickens. My name is Nisa Luckman, and I'll be your moderator for tonight. This is the third of a 5-part spring webinar series taking place on Tuesday evenings at 7 p.m. in April and May. These webinars are hosted by the Durham Environmental Advisory Committee, otherwise known as DEAC, which is a council-appointed citizen committee of volunteers who are dedicated to promoting community outreach and stewardship through various activities and projects to support environmental awareness and appreciation in the region, including educational opportunities such as these. Tonight's webinar is focused on raising backyard chickens and is geared towards residents living in rural areas where local area municipal zoning bylaws allow the raising of backyard livestock. Now, before we turn it to our program for tonight, I would just like to make a quick housekeeping note. Please use the chat Q&A function for any questions you have for our presenter, and we'll make sure that those get answered. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for the evening. Dr. Margaret Fisher is a veterinarian with over 30 years of experience working with both large and small animals. She is a founding member of the River City Chicken Group, which came together in 2009 to advocate for urban hens in Edmonton, Alberta, which became a reality with a pilot project in 2014 and a full-fledged program thereafter. RCC has assisted many municipalities to develop hen programs and is very active in providing the incredibly popular Chickens 101 course, which is required in many urban centers in order to facilitate hen licenses. Take it away, Dr. Margaret Fisher.
I believe you're just on mute. Oh, if you could just press Alt-Tab, you should be able to get back to your Teams to get to the controls and then unmute.
Sorry about that. My Alt-Tab wasn't working real well for me, but okay, are we okay now?
Yep, all set.
Okay, sorry. Okay, let's jump right in. It's always fun to talk about chickens, and just a little bit of background about River City Chickens in case any of you want to petition your municipality to allow hens. We were just a small informal group of volunteers who got together. It was actually 2007. And we were successful in lobbying our local city council in Edmonton to permit hens. And now we focus on ongoing outreach, educational seminars like this one. And we have two classes that we put on pretty regularly, Chicken 101 and Chickens 201, which just sort of takes the practice of raising hens into a little more detail for people. So this was a diagram that I came across last week. I thought it was really interesting. We'll talk about why on earth someone would want to have chickens, but this is an interesting graphic that says that one chicken can debug 120 square feet a week. It produces a lot of manure, and that manure is pure gold for composters and gardeners. They're wonderful little rototillers. They just love to scratch and dig, and they will spread your mulch for you. Interestingly enough, I'm not sure in Ontario if there's an issue with maggots that affect your fruit trees, but the hens are excellent at eating those maggots and breaking the cycle of a lot of those pests. Of course, they produce a great fertilizer. And something that I've really noticed is the amount of food, kitchen scrap that I can give to the chickens instead of rooting into a garbage stream. So besides the eggs, there's lots of great reasons to have hens. So egg facts. Look at all those beautiful colors. The taste of a freshly laid egg is superior to anything that you're going to buy in a store. Fresh eggs are absolutely delicious. If any of you have traveled to places in Europe or Mexico, you may note that the eggs that are for sale in the grocery stores are not kept in the refrigerator. They're out at room temperature. And that's because in those countries, eggs are sold unwashed. And it's a really interesting egg fact that when the egg is laid, there's a coating that the hen places over top of the egg as it's laid. And this seals the pores in the eggshell and allows that egg to remain at room temperature without spoiling for many, many weeks. And this facilitates the hen laying a number of eggs before she actually incubates them and hatches chicks. So for approximately a month, those eggs are going to be at room temperature or warmer under a hen, and the cuticle, or bloom as it's known, will prevent the egg from spoiling. And a last fun fact about eggs is that the egg color is determined by the breed of the hen. So brown hens don't always lay brown eggs, nor do white hens necessarily lay white eggs. So it's determined by breed. Here's another fun chicken fact. Hens can live for over 10 years. And certainly when we're talking to people who are wanting to get hens, we make them aware of this because they won't lay eggs consistently for 10 years. Usually, depending on the breed, it's only the first few years that they're reliably laying. So that's something to keep in mind when thinking about whether to get hens. This is a really common myth that roosters are required for eggs. And in fact, they're not. A rooster's presence is not in any way needed for egg production. Many flocks in rural settings will have a rooster both to create fertilized eggs so that people can raise chicks, but they do perform some pretty valuable predator patrol. Where I live out on the coast of BC, most of the flocks here have at least one rooster because there are just so many predators that can come in and kill the chickens if they're free ranging. So roosters do play a role, but not in egg production. Egg size varies hugely. Look at this massive egg next to a relatively small one. Typically, a young hen is called a pullet. When they're just starting out to lay, they typically will lay pretty small eggs. And then depending on the breed, they can lay these absolute monsters. I believe this was a triple yolker, which is really rare. I get double yolkers fairly frequently, but not a triple yolker. So we've got a few Ontario cities on here. It's kind of an interesting note that in some of the early cities in the United States, such as San Francisco, hens have always been allowed, and they've never been struck off the allowable animal list. But really gaining momentum in places in BC and Alberta, and I think all throughout Ontario as well. So people are embracing the urban hen movement, that's for sure. So let's talk about some other maybe not so obvious benefits of having hens besides the composting, the manure, the food scraps, and of course those wonderful eggs. It's a bit of a false economy to get hens because those eggs are going to end up being pretty expensive by the time you build a coop and buy treats for them. And but it is nice to have that security of knowing that even a small part of your diet, you know where it came from, and that you can reliably count on going out and getting fresh eggs for breakfast and other meals. And that's a wonderful feeling. There's certainly some environmental positives in having hens. That whole reduction of waste and creation of rich compost to use in the garden those are wonderful environmental spin-offs. And it's a really wonderful way to meet neighbors. This is clearly pre-COVID times, but it allows connections to be made with your neighborhood, because people are fascinated by chickens. It's really interesting how many people in my old neighborhood in Edmonton, they always wanted to know, how are those chickens? And I can hear them sometimes making funny little noises, and it's a real connection within neighbors. I mentioned pest control. They are incredible hunters. They've got very keen eyesight. There's certain bugs that they don't really care for. I've never had chickens that like slugs, but you know, June bugs and beetles and mosquitoes, they'll try to take them out of the air. They're really wonderful for that. Great way of upcycling or recycling your grass clippings. They love fresh grass, and they'll get in there and scratch and dig and eat. And of course, the compost we've already mentioned. It's really a valuable tool to have chickens, to teach young people and children about responsible pet ownership, to educate them about biology, about food and where our food comes from, and to emphasize the importance of welfare for animals. And it's quite endearing. Many hens will allow themselves to be tamed quite readily. The ones that I have right now are a laying variety, and they were not raised with a lot of human interaction, but they just by nature are curious and friendly and love to follow me around, and they don't mind at all when I pick them up. This is a wonderful cartoon that we came across when we were preparing our presentations for our Edmonton Council, and it's really quite humorous, I think. But we did certainly go through a lot of opposition as to, you know, hens being in the city and how can you even consider that. There's certainly some cities, I'm not sure what the situation is in Ontario, but there's certainly some cities out west where the city councils feel that this is a step backward to have hens in the city. I want to just take a moment and emphasize that there really is significant differences between having a small urban flock, which typically is 3 to 6 birds. Most municipalities will have the maximum number of birds at 6. There's a lot of challenges to keeping a small number of birds, especially in the wintertime. And these situations are really vastly different from a rural situation where you could have typically many more birds. Fewer birds in a city situation or urban create less heat. The coop needs to be quite small to allow that heat to be conserved. Whereas in a farm or rural situation, there's not usually the same restrictions on bird numbers, and birds can be in a larger sized chicken coop or within a barn. Sometimes those buildings are heated, and there's also more options to providing heat in that type of an environment as opposed to the city. Urban hens tend to have a much lower parasite problem, whereas rural situations where there's been flocks in existence perhaps for decades may encounter more internal parasite problems. There's less of a concern with disease spread with urban flocks because they're just by nature quite isolated from other flocks, whereas in a rural situation there's possibly more exposure to waterfowl, and many neighbors, feed trucks, vets sometimes going from farm to farm to farm can increase the risk of disease spread. So very different situations. So some of the opponents to urban hens will say hens are too noisy. They can't be in the city because they produce too much noise. So some decibel measurements were taken of human conversation, neighbors talking outside, for example, coming in at about 60 decibels. A squawking chicken, and I'm going to explain this in a minute, at 63. busy traffic noise at 80, a lawnmower 90, and a barking dog 100. So remember, we're not talking about roosters now, even though this is a picture of a rooster crowing. Chickens, hens, females don't make a lot of noise. They'll make very quiet little cooing or chirping noises if they're happy, with the exception of when they lay an egg. And when they do lay an egg, they do feel that it's their prerogative to tell the world about it. And they will make what's called an egg squawk, which I embarrass my family when I do this, but I don't care. For those of you not familiar with it, it is typically something like this. And they'll do that for, depending on the bird, some of them don't do it at all. 10 seconds, 30 seconds. I have had the odd hen go on for a couple of minutes, but that's really the extent of it. So that egg squawk measures in at about 63 decibels. So much lower than some commonly accepted urban noises. Chickens are smelly. You can't have them in the city because they smell. So all poop smells, whether it's from a chicken or a dog or a cat or a human, and it doesn't matter, poop smells. And chickens themselves, just like most animals, don't really have a smell. In fact, much less so, I would say, than a horse or a cow. When you pick a chicken up, unless they're covered, in poop from having diarrhea or something, they really don't have a smell. And this is not dozens and dozens of chickens that have been enclosed in a barn that we're talking about. We're talking about just a handful of them. And part of the chicken chores that people need to do is to go out and remove the manure in a fairly frequent fashion and either compost it or put it into the waste stream. So this is just a quote from one of the City of Edmonton compost people talking about chicken poop being no more of a challenge to compost. In fact, it's easy to compost than anything else. So really, smell has not been ever raised as a complaint in an urban setting that I'm aware of. Disease is always of a concern, and rightly so, but there are very few diseases that chickens can have that can cause problems with people. Very, very few. And I love this quote. This is from Dr. Walter Tays, who's, I think he's a professor emeritus at Guelph. But I love this quote, and I touch base with him every few years and say hi and ask him if his quote is still valid. He goes, oh, yes. So he's a veterinarian and has special training as an epidemiologist. And epidemiologists study disease transmission. And his area of specialty is diseases that people get from animals. And his quote is that he knows of no evidence linking human illness with keeping small urban flocks. So if you have a situation with people who have a compromised immune system, then that will require extra care. And there is a small risk of salmonella, more so with chicks than with mature hens, and we're talking about mature hens. So there needs to be some common sense and some hand washing with warm soap and water, but we just don't see an issue with disease spreading from hens in small flocks to people. Can't have hens in the city because they'll attract coyotes. That is, in fact, not the case. This is a bit of a strange map to get your head around, but the gray and blue blotchy areas are areas of coyote density within the city of Edmonton. The little black triangles are coyote sightings that have been reported, and the red circles are some chicken sites. And what this shows is that there really is not a correlation or between the location of the chicken sites and where the coyotes are hanging out. Unfortunately, urban coyotes become used to and seek garbage as one of their main food sources. They will come in from ravines and hunt hares if your city happens to have hares like Edmonton does. And they will, of course, pick off cats and dogs. But chickens have not, and chicken coop sites have not been a source of coyote attraction to date in Edmonton. Cold weather is certainly a concern. There's no reason that you can't keep hens in very, very cold climates, but it is very important to ensure that the coops are well insulated, very well ventilated, that there's some sort of an emergency heat source for those nights, days and nights that can get down to -25 and colder. And it's vitally important to choose good breeds, winter hardy breeds, when having hens in these cold climates. So it's interesting. When I worked in Ontario for a couple of years, and there are a number of farmers that would buy calves, weaned calves, and then put them in their barns. And these calves would be in relatively unventilated barns, and the moisture levels would build up, and then the calves would get pneumonia. And it's the same with chickens. Chickens produce a lot of moisture through their breath and their poop, and they really must be in a well ventilated coop. When we teach our 101 class, we recommend 0.5 to 1 square feet of opening up in the roof per hen. So if you just think about that for a minute, if you've got 6 hens, that's up to 6 square feet of a hole in the roof to allow the warmer airflow passively to escape and take the moisture with it. So these issues are very, very important to pay attention to if you're going to have hens in a cold environment, which of course Ontario can be. So what do these chickens need? Appropriate housing, of course, food. Usually layer ration is what most people feed their hens. Lots of water. When hens are in egg production, it's shocking how much water they go through. It really is shocking. Veterinary care, should it be required. A vacation or a hen sitter, if we are ever allowed to go on vacation again. There's a certain time commitment. And there's, of course, a certain financial commitment, especially initially. Now, I'm not sure how we're doing for time. I think we're pretty good here. I just wanted to show you a few urban coops in Edmonton. This is a real beauty. It's quite large. This is one of the coops that one of our very founding members built. This is the coop that I used to have in my place in Edmonton. Just a note on this style of coop. It's really nice to have that walk-in feature. This is often referred to as shed style. The window is also a nice feature. It faces into the run, which is covered in hardware mesh. So chicken wire doesn't cut the mustard here. You need hardware mesh. But this is a hard coop to keep warm enough with only 3 or 4 birds in the winter. It's too big, and there's a lot of air in there, and the heat does dissipate. So this is not a great style of coop for only a handful of birds. This is probably the most popular urban hen coop design. It's called the garden coop, and there are plans on the internet that you can purchase for this. It does need modification. These designs were intended for fairly moderate climates, such as Portland, San Francisco, Victoria, Vancouver, where it gets really cold. Then they do need to be modified in that they need 6-sided insulation, as well as good ventilation on the top. So this is a really nice one too for the city, because there's the space underneath the coop that can be utilized for run square footage for the hens. That's just another variation of the garden coop. Now I'm going to try to play a video, so you may want to make sure your sound's cranked up. And And hopefully I've hit the right setting. I should probably check that. Let me just bear with me for a minute. I think we should be okay. Maybe Roger will interrupt me if we need to here.
So it looks like the video didn't quite play properly.
Okay, so it's not running.
Can we try using the system audio button when you go to share?
Okay, so, oh. All right, Roger, you're going to have to help me with where that is.
No problem. So when you just go to share in Teams on the bottom there, and then there should be a little box that you can just check for include system audio or use computer sound.
Okay.
And then now we can share it.
All right, let's give this another try. Sorry, folks. Just gonna back it up. And Roger, you just interrupt if that's not working.
Hi there, my name is Carrie and I'm going to tell you about how I built my own hen enclosure. Here is what it looks like. As I give you the sneak peek, I'll tell you a little bit about my favorite features and how I put the entire thing together so that I could have lovely hens laying in my urban farm. First, I highly recommend that you look at the city guidelines because they'll provide you with the space requirements for each of your hens, as well as information about where you can place the coop on your property. The next step would be to look online and find yourself an example of the kind of hen enclosure that you want to make. I wanted to make this style, which is known as, I think, the garden enclosure, and believe it or not, this style is exactly what my hen enclosure is, exactly like this. Once I had my hen enclosure style picked out, I plotted it out on my property with some general dimensions based on the city's guidelines for size requirements and placement on my property. And then I submitted essentially a picture of the hen enclosure I liked from online with the general measurements that my own hen enclosure would be. Now my hen enclosure is made with logs, so I collected some logs from a piece of property that we own out of the city, and I stripped each of the logs, and then I put in the main support logs just like you would a fence post into the ground. That was really the only plan I had until that point. Here is the main frame of my hen enclosure put together somehow by magic with a lot of screws. Then it was time to start framing inside of my logs with 2x2s and 2x4s, one little section at a time. Essentially, you're trying to build a box inside of the enclosure. We used plywood to build the floor and slowly framed everything out one wall at a time. We didn't have plans, so we just sort of had to problem solve and think through each side of the coop on our own. But really, it's a box, so it isn't too hard to figure out once you get started. We used plywood on the sides and just put cedar boarding over top to make it look pretty. We got the roof logs in. You may decide to use posts instead of logs. And then we had a nice slanted roof for the rain. We put plywood on top, and then eventually I put cedar shakes to be my shingles. I should note that we also insulated the inside of the coop, and if I were to do one thing differently, it would be to use more insulation because the winters here are cold and it's hard to heat. We did use vapor barrier. We haven't had an issue with moisture buildup, but some people have said they do. Here we added linoleum stickers to the bottom of the floor to help cleaning up the chicken poop, and it's been a big help. The only thing left was the gate. Now, I have to say that one of the special features I picked was this double barn door gate because I liked the idea that I could open the top and feed my chickens and water them without them running out. It was a big success. This is our sliding hen house door, which took a little bit of work to put together, and there are a few different designs, but I'm definitely happy to have something that opens and closes from outside of the enclosure. One of the features that I particularly like about my hen house is the ability to open up the entire coop because it makes it much easier to clean by just scooping out all of that straw into a big bin and put it into the compost. So that was a feature I knew I wanted to have. We put lots of ventilation, 1 square foot per bird, and what you can't see from the inside is that from the top, I built a sliding door so that I could adjust the amount of ventilation depending on how the chickens seem to be doing inside of the coop. In terms of the nesting boxes, one of the features I really liked and knew I wanted was one that opened from the side. This is because in the winter, it's hard to open up from the top because the snow's on top of it, and if it's raining, you don't want rain falling inside of your nesting boxes. So unlike most designs, I built my nesting box to open from the side with little chains too so that I could leave it open without it falling down on me. Finally, the windows were a bit of a pain. I chose to go with these. I picked up these windows from an antique store and sort of cut them to size, but I have to admit that they don't provide a lot of insulation, so you may need to stuff insulation in there with some corrugated plastic in the winter. Finally, here's another run through of my beautiful hen house, which we're really happy to have. Again, we didn't have a plan, but we did take the time to figure out what our favoriteest features were and piece it together bit by bit. The internet is your friend. Do research on the internet. There's a lot of good advice and tips and tricks, and even plans if you feel more comfortable working with a plan. We couldn't be happier with how our hen house turned out, and I'm glad that I spent time on the extra details because not only is it functional for our hens, but it's a beautiful feature of our house.
She's quite the woman. It's a beautiful, beautiful coop. These are just some photos of different hens that live in and around Edmonton for fun. And then we'll have some time for some questions. Kids really enjoy being with the hens, and it's quite magical to spend time with them. They're very amusing animals. For those of you who have not been around chickens, they really are fun to watch. This family had a lot of teenage angst in their family, and really spoke strongly about how important it was for the girls to have their hens, and it really helped them go through some tough times. It's never old to find eggs in those nest boxes. It's just a joy. This is just our River City Chicken website, which has quite a bit of information on different resources, including a winter resource that, of course, you're welcome to check out. And I think we have time for questions now.
Absolutely. So, first question for you, Margaret. First of all, thank you very much for that very informative presentation. We'll start with the first question. How many hens would be in that coop from that video?
Oh, probably 4 to 6, depending on the square footage. So There is a requirement in most municipalities for 4 square feet per hen. So six hens would require 36 square feet. So 4 to 6 is fairly typical.
Great, thank you so much. We'll just give folks a couple extra minutes to send in more questions. In the meantime, I think I'll ask a question. What is the most rewarding aspect of backyard hens?
Oh, well, I mean, I guess for me, it was very rewarding to see our city council be convinced and acknowledge that it was worth a try and allow a pilot project, which then morphed into the hen program. So that was a real sense of accomplishment from a personal perspective. But probably the most rewarding, I think, for me is that combination of feeling like I'm not throwing food away, and in return, I'm getting these wonderful eggs. So it's that provides really nice feeling. It really does.
Excellent. So we have a couple of questions that have come in. The first one is, do you compost the shavings as well? And is that the best bedding for them?
That's a great question. I do. I try to, I'm not a compost expert by any stretch. It just seems to magically happen. But the shavings, I think, are a valuable brown addition. So they go in as well. I do try to come up with systems. I don't know if you noticed in the video, but Carrie had put boards directly underneath the roosts. Chickens poop a lot at night, and if you can have a system where you can collect that poop and then scrape that right out into either your trash or your compost, it does cut down on the amount of bedding you go through. I like bedding because it's easy to get. It's relatively inexpensive depending on where you live, and I'm not a real fan of straw. Straw provides lots of little hiding places for mites. Some people really like hemp bedding, which is a little bit pricey, but there's different, I guess, different personal choices, but I would say most people use shavings, absolutely.
Excellent. The next question is, how soon do I know whether I have a rooster or hen? When do chicks go outside?
Yes, so most breeds and varieties of chickens you cannot differentiate male from female as chicks. Most breeds, by the time they're 4 months of age, you can tell the difference between a male and a female. The males start to develop longer, more fulsome feathers in the neck area. Those are called hackle feathers. But it can be a little tricky for sure. So by 4 or 5 months, for most breeds, you should be able to tell the difference.
Fantastic. The next question is, what do you recommend for the ground? My hens dig a lot of holes and scratch the grass to death. Yes,
they do. They really do. And I don't think there's an easy answer to that. You know, I think free ranging them is nice. but they will ruin a garden and of course kill the grass very quickly. So some people rig up a movable fence and then they allow the chickens in one section one day and then they move it so that they can rotate where the chickens have access to. But that's a lot of work. But if you've got, if you've got more than just a handful of hens, they really will ruin the ground. Some people will make chicken tunnels. If you Google that, it's kind of a funny little. They make them out of chicken wire, but they're just long tubes basically that the chickens can go in, and then they can eat the grass. But it's a little harder for them to scratch because the chicken wire is there, so they can eat the grass but not scratch so much. So that might be an option if you Google chicken tubes.
All right, the next question is, do you have to routinely rework chickens? I think they mean deworm.
Oh, yeah, I guess it depends on what your situation is. In an urban situation or a relatively new flock that's only been in existence for maybe a couple of years, it would be very unusual to see a worm problem. If you are suspicious of a worm problem, one of the good things about worms is they're pretty easy to diagnose, and you just have to go out and grab a whole bunch of fresh poo and put it in a plastic bag and take it into your vet, and the vet can run a fecal sample and just see if there's a large number of eggs in the stool, and that might be an indication that there could be a problem, but it's pretty unusual.
All right, the next question is, our rooster is losing its feathers. Do they molt in the spring?
So typically they don't molt in the spring, but I have heard, I don't have a lot of experience with roosters. I'm just sitting on the fence right now whether to get one or not. But I know that if you do put a rooster in with the ladies during breeding season, which of course the spring is, sometimes the hens will actually pull feathers off the rooster, and especially if he's a relatively young or inexperienced rooster. So it could be feather pulling from the birds within the flock itself. Unusual to molt in the spring.
Thank you so much. The next question is, can guinea hens live together with chickens? I have been thinking about getting guinea hens for taking care of ticks.
I don't, I don't have personal experience with that. I've heard that, that's not an issue. Where I live, it seems like the more species you can blend together, the better. So, but I'd do some research on it, but I have heard that can work just fine.
The next question is, when is the next 101 and 201?
Well, we just missed the last 101 class. We had it on Sunday. So there's a 201 class tomorrow night. So that if you are interested, the tickets are through Eventbrite, which is an online ticket purchasing platform. And we do run the 101 class, which is about 2.5 hours of, we cover a lot of material. We try to get all the basics in there so that people can feel confident that they can make a start anyway. We don't have a date picked for that one, but probably it will be toward the end of June, middle to end of June. But if you look at the River City Chicken website, it should pop up, the date should pop up in there.
Thank you so much. What kind of treats do you give the chickens?
Oh, there's so many things that chickens like. They love meat. They absolutely love meat. If you trim a steak and cut the pieces, I mean, you're a chicken fanatic when you're cutting your table scraps into bite-sized pieces for the chickens, which I do. Any wilted lettuce or spinach or greens at all, they love that as that's nice and healthy. You just got to be careful not to give them too much fruit because they can get diarrhea, but they do like fruit. A really healthy treat that they like is black oiled sunflower seeds. They really like those. They like yogurt, this gravy. You just have to use a little bit of common sense, because just like it's not very healthy or good for your tummy to sit down and eat a bunch of gravy, the same goes for chicken. So a little tiny leftover amount is not going to cause a tummy upset, but I would say meat and greens and black oiled sunflower seeds are right up there. And that's, of course, if you don't want to spend a ton of money. If you want to actually lose money on your chickens, then they love crickets and mealworms. Mealworms are wonderful.
Excellent. The next question is, what are the bylaws in Durham region for backyard chickens, or is it determined by municipality? And I can help answer this one. From a Durham perspective, it is up to your local area municipal bylaw. So I would check with your municipality to see what's allowed in terms of where you live, because it is very much based on where your property is located and how it is zoned. The next question is, may the eggs be sold to consumers?
Yeah, so that's something that I can't answer for your area. I know that for most urban municipalities, eggs are not allowed to be sold. However, a lot of people will barter those eggs. I've got a friend who barters. She loves East Indian food, so she barters eggs for East Indian food. So that's going to be a region by region ruling, I would think.
Great, thank you. What do you do when your hens are no longer laying and you cannot keep them as pets?
So again, I guess it depends on where you live. I find that there are a lot of people on acreages that can never get enough chickens and will quite happily take, we're not talking about a lot of birds from an urban situation. So I've never had a problem rehoming mine to someone who has either a small farm or an acreage. That's what most people do. Depending on your philosophy, there are people who will make arrangements to have the birds butchered and then eat them, or if they're older hens, they're probably better for making soup as opposed to chicken meat per se. So it really does depend on what your philosophy is.
Thank you. Straw takes a long time to compost, so do wood chips. Any comments about disposing of them?
Yeah, so I guess it depends on your setup. I do know people who will take the straw and the manure, and rather than compost them, they'll actually use it as mulch, which I always thought that you'd burn the plants with the fresh manure, but this person sort of puts it on the edge. So that's one thought. But in the municipalities, they are allowed to go out with the organic waste stream. So they're just bagged and put out with the trash.
Thank you. Is it common for a hen or two to have some very raw spots on their back and wings?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I've got to be careful not to answer specific questions as a vet, but in the general sense, yes, that is quite common. They can be fighting. If there's a rooster involved, the rooster can be scratching them. And of course, depending on your weather, they can then get sunburned or irritated. So all of those are possibilities, and you just have to try to figure that one out.
All right. Are cedar shavings used or a different type of wood?
Typically not cedar because it's quite, well, we like it. It can be irritating to their respiratory tracts. Cedars, there's a sort of a high oil content that tends to irritate them. So the shavings that I think most people use are a combination of aspen or alder, and the low scent ones would be the ones to get.
All right. What are the best kitchen scraps to give them?
Do some research because there's some that they shouldn't get. Green potato peelings and a lot of leaves, so rhubarb leaves that have oxalic acid are not good for them. Too much fruit isn't good for them. But other than that, meat scraps are great. Any kind of vegetable, I'll give them. You know, if I've got a pepper that's kind of gone all withered and I've forgotten about, or zucchini, same comment. They like cucumbers. Tomatoes, I'm careful with tomatoes because again, there's a high acid content, so you don't want to give them diarrhea. They absolutely love grapes. Meat, fat. Yeah, Brussels sprouts. You know, when you trim a Brussels sprout, all those things they love.
Excellent. I found that my older hens, about 2.5 years old, start looking ragged. The feathers on their necks and around their back ends become rather sparse.
Yeah, and you know, it depends on the breed, I guess. They could be going through a hard molt. If there's a rooster, then that could also contribute to it. But if they're a laying hen variety, a lot of these birds are not genetically designed to last more than about a year. Commercially, most flocks are culled, as in taken to slaughter, before they're even a year of age, and so they're just not designed to last a long time. So the other thing to think about is if they're heavy layers, then that takes a toll on the body. These little layers that I have, they produce a big brown egg every single day, and that's a big drain on the energy and nutrients. So it's super important that they get lots of supplements and lots of protein and calcium, but it may just be that they're naturally spent.
All right, thank you so much. Thoughts on feeding chicks medicated food, and is vaccination necessary? I have ordered my chicks from a hatchery because I was nervous to get them from local people since they would not be vaccinated.
That's a super question. So vaccines are getting chicks from a hatchery is the best way to get vaccinated birds, and there's many different conditions that are included in the vaccines that they get. Probably one of the ones that most people are concerned about with chicks anyway is coccidia, which is a parasite that tends to affect quite young chicks, and that's the question about the medicated feed. So when chicks come home and they are put on it's called a chick starter, then you have the option of buying medicated, which has a low level of a medication that kills coccidia, or unmedicated. So if they're vaccinated, then you don't want, against coccidia, then you don't want to have the medicated feed. But if they're not vaccinated, then I guess it's your choice. I personally chose to use medicated feed because I don't want to put all the time and money and effort into buying and then raising chicks only to lose them to coccidia. So that's, I guess, a personal choice, and you have to keep the brooding area scrupulously clean. And these little birds, they poop a lot. So I think you're wise to get vaccinated chicks. And I think that if it were easier to get some different breeds through the hatchery, then everyone would be doing that. But unfortunately, they tend to only have certain breeds. But I think you're wise to get vaccinated birds through the hatchery for sure.
Thank you. What is used to support eggshell strength?
Well, until recently, oyster shells, but there seems to be some sort of a shortage. I'm not really sure I understand how COVID impacts oyster shell supply, but nevertheless, it seems to. There seem to be a couple of camps. Some people like to dry and crush their eggshells and then feed them back to the chickens as a calcium source. I don't do that because I don't want the work of it. And I also have heard that there's the odd really smart bird that'll recognize it as an eggshell and then will, may start pecking at the eggs. And once a hen develops an egg pecking and then eating habit, it's hard to break, and that's not what you want. So I use oyster shell. Some people will use calcium carbonate, which is, they just look like little white pellets. But they're not very expensive and usually readily available.
All right. How often should a coop be cleaned?
I guess it depends how many birds you have, but for an urban flock, with regular removal of the droppings, we do recommend a deep clean twice a year where you actually strip everything out, all the bedding, get in there with a pressure washer and some sort of a disinfectant and scrub it all down before putting fresh bedding in and the chickens back in. If you've got a disease situation, you may have to do it a little more frequently, but twice a year is sort of a typical frequency.
Where should my 6-week-old chicks live? A coop outdoors or with me indoors?
Well, I guess it depends on where you live and what the temperature is and how many chicks you have. We had this discussion with meat chicks, and we decided to put them out in an enclosed room within the barn. So it's a very small little room that is ventilated. And then we fuss about whether it's warm enough for the first few weeks. I think it depends on your personality a little bit too. If you're a worrier, it's kind of nice to have them in the house and then you can check on them. If you're not so much a worrier and you've got a good setup out in the barn, then the only problem with chicks is they need it to be very, very warm, and heat lamps are very, very dangerous. So at least if you're in the house, they're in the house, you can check on that heat lamp and make sure that it's not too hot and that the birds are at the right temperature. But that's a bit of a preference.
Do they like raw meat?
In my experience, chickens love raw meat.
All right. What kind of enrichment activities can you suggest for winter when they are stuck in?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you can buy suet for wild birds and hang the suet for them to peck at. You can buy those, they're Kong treat balls or treat dispensers for dogs and cats that you can put some grain in that, and they have to sort of kick it around and then it'll shoot out a little bit of food. You can make your own easily enough with just, a round pop plastic bottle and put a few holes in it, and then as it moves, it dispenses a little bit of grain. A xylophone is always fun. They love to peck, and so they'll peck and play songs for you. If it's not too cold, you can string apples, popcorn, cabbages up, and they'll peck away at those. If you can buy bugs, you could usually buy crickets, live crickets at the pet store. And again, if it's not too cold to immediately freeze the cricket, that's a fun thing for them to do as well. Chase the crickets around and catch them.
My son wants to know why chickens lay different colored eggs.
Because they're different breeds. So that's just a breed characteristic. And depending on what breed the chicken is, depends on what tint the eggshell will be.
Great. Peeling hard-boiled eggs that are fresh is challenging. Any suggestions?
You know, I saw an article about steaming them, but I didn't read it. What I personally do is, with those really fresh ones, I crack them. So I get them out of the hot water and then I crack them so that the water can get in, and then I put them in ice water. And I have found that that makes it just a little bit easier for most of them. There's always that one egg that is just impossible to peel, but that has helped.
Is it wrong to give them spaghetti? They love the leftovers.
All things in moderation. I sound like my mother, but I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Keep in mind that if you give them onions and garlic, too much is not healthy, but it's possible that the egg can assume a bit of a garlic or an onion flavor, which some people just say you're pre-seasoning your eggs. So a small amount should be fine.
Oh, the follow-up to that was no sauce, just spaghetti noodles.
Oh, well, there you go. Yeah, you don't want to give chickens too many carbs. It's just like us. You know, you want at least 90% of their diet to be well rationed layer diet, and then the treats are a small portion on top of that.
The next question is, other than chick feed, what can we give the chicks?
I know a lot of people who will give chicks little bits of dirt and grass to, there's thought that giving them dirt is healthy for them, just small amounts. I found they're not really interested in the grass, but you could try little bits of lettuce, just to sort of get them used to pecking at it. Excuse me, and recognizing it as a food source. You could try bugs, you know, if they're interested in them. It won't hurt them to eat a little bug.
Great. The last, this is more of a comment, not so much a question, is, I am a worrier, but we live in Florida.
That would be the question about the chicks, I bet. Whether to have them in or out. I think if I lived in Florida, I'd be having them outside, but whatever, maybe it's a better temperature inside if you live in Florida.
All right. Well, that concludes the list of questions here. Dr. Fisher, I'd like to thank you so much for taking the time to present on behalf of the Durham Environmental Advisory Committee. This was a very enriching conversation and presentation, pun intended. Mm-hmm. If there are no further questions, I think we can end the session today. For folks still watching, please feel free to sign up for our remaining 2 sessions. We have one on creative gardening next week, and the final presentation will be about a reading on climate change.
Great. All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Best of luck.